So today we're going to look at the quotations from an Inspector Calls, and we're going to look at all the characters and all of their key quotations. So the first thing I would do is screenshot these and print them, use them, annotate them how you wish before I start to highlight on them and talk about them. If you would prefer to put them onto flashcards, then again, screenshot them. You can do that as preparation. So I'll give you a second to print screen or screenshot now. And we're going to kick it off with Eva Smith Quotations. Now, what's interesting about Eva is obviously she never says any of these herself. She doesn't have a voice in the play. The person who gives her that positive voice, that voice that really considers her feelings, is the inspector. So he is the person that gives her that voice. But we see everyone's perceptions of Eva, and everyone gives us an opinion about her apart from her. Now that's interesting because it could symbolize the way the lower classes didn't have a voice in society and the way they couldn't express themselves. So Eva not being there, Eva not even being mentioned in a flashback, really where she has specific dialogue, it's all said through the lens of people who are in a higher class. So we'll kick off with what they've said about her. So looking at this quotation here from Gerald in the middle, where he says that she wanted to be Daisy Renton. So if we look at that, Gerald obviously talks about Eva wanting to change after everything that's happened to her, after losing her jobs. And I say jobs because obviously she lost the job at Millward and the job at Mr. Burling's company. When he says she wanted to be Daisy Renton, he shows us that she wanted to change identity. But he doesn't elaborate on that. He just talks about how she wanted a fresh start. And obviously Gerald believes that he's the person who gives her that fresh start. But we'll look at how Gerald's quite a negative character further on. But again, this quotation is just there to show how Gerald's perception of Daisy and Gerald's way of giving a voice to Daisy isn't necessarily a nice thing for him to do. He's talking about her needing a fresh start, but he doesn't actually provide a very positive fresh start for her. And we'll look at that more in this other quotation where he says she looked young and fresh and charming. And what I really want to highlight here are the adjectives young and fresh. So, first of all, we'll zoom in on the adjective young. Now, we all know, if we've done our revision for Inspector Calls, that a woman's appearance was her most valuable asset. In being young, she is perceived as more attractive, and he sees her as better because she is young. She's not an older woman. He sees her as better. He sees her as more valuable. Then we've got the adjective fresh, and this is where we really see a lot of negativity coming from Gerald. So when he says fresh, he means she's untouched, she's new. And again, it's the idea that Gerald is quite shallow. He sees her as something new to almost play with. And it's very interesting in this idea, this sort of imagery of the flower that goes with Eva when she becomes Daisy. Daisies are picked when they are fresh. We enjoy them for their beauty, but ultimately we discard them. And that's what Gerald does when she's not fresh anymore, when he's had what he wants from her, when he's gone into that relationship with her, he then discards her and goes back to Sheila, which is a more beneficial relationship business-wise. And we have some similar points coming from Eric as well. So he says she was pretty and a good sport. This adjective pretty comes up a lot. It also comes up further on with Sheila as well. So they say she was pretty, and that repetition of the adjective is very important from Priestley. He doesn't vary his vocabulary. He doesn't say she was beautiful. He doesn't say she was gorgeous. He specifically sticks with the same adjective. And that's because we're meant to be drawn to that adjective. We are meant to think about that adjective more. and the way everyone describes her with that adjective because they see her worth in her appearance. And Mr. Burling also says she was a lively, good-looking girl. He joins in on this. He talks about her being good-looking and again shows that he also sees her or her value in her looks. But he specifically draws our attention, and by he I mean Priestley, to moments where she is actually valued for things that perhaps make her strong. So the fact that she had a voice, she had a lot to say, far too much. She had a voice. She was happy to stick up for herself and to be an assertive woman and to stick up for not just her rights, but the rights of other employees as well. And we can see here how she actually says quite a lot and then is ripped down by Mr. Burling because women in the working classes didn't have a voice. They didn't have that option. So he does say she'd had a lot to say, far too much, so she had to go. And if we look at that imperative language, so imperative language meaning very commanding language, she had to go. He talks about this as though he has absolutely no option but to let her go because she is sticking up for herself. We then move on to Mrs. Burling. And if you look at what Mrs. Burling says about Eva, she is constantly trying to build a barrier between them. That goes back to when Sheila says they mustn't put up a wall. But Mrs. Burling very specifically does that at every point she can. So we can see here, girls of that class. So we're going to look at the dismissiveness of this phrase when we analyse it. So the noun girls is really interesting because it is infantilizing her. By infantilizing, what I mean there is that she is treating her as a child. Eva was in her 20s. Eva was a woman. And the fact that she calls her girls really shows that she's going out of her way to be disrespectful. She's trying to be disrespectful here. She's trying to treat Eva as though she was less than her. And she calls her a girl, a child almost. And then we'll look at the way she says that. Girls of that class. So we look at the determiner that. She's pushing her into a category. Girls of that class. She's not even saying the working class. She is being dismissive. That class. Pushing it away from her. She also is generalizing. So when you generalize people, that's really where you give rise to prejudice. If you group lots of people into a specific category, you are normally then making wide judgments about those people. And that is what Mrs. Burling is doing here. So she's looking at Eva through a lens of prejudice. And then we see the blame. So she had only herself to blame. Now, this is quite an ironic statement. And by ironic, it means the last thing we would really expect, the opposite of what we would expect. Because when she says she only had herself to blame, it's quite interesting because the entire play we've seen where other people were also to blame for what happened to her. So when Mr. Burling says they wanted the rates raised so they could average about 25 shillings a week, I refused, of course. If we look at the way he again shows that dismissive tone and says, I refused, of course, it's really interesting because that phrase, of course, shows that he almost had no other option other than to refuse. And what I find interesting there is that he thinks that he was well within his right to refuse. And as an employer, yes, he was. However, he did that despite knowing that these women probably needed that pay rise. They were members of the working class. They were women and they would have been struggling at the time. But Mr. Burling, who is clearly doing very well, and remember, Priestley shows us how well he is doing at the start with all the champagne glasses and the port and the dessert plates. Again, think about why it's dessert plates. It's not the main course, it's dessert. It's extra. It's something that we indulge in. It's a luxury. And so actually at this point, I refused, of course. It shows that Mr. Burling is saying, of course, because he believes that he was well within his right to keep that wealth to himself. And that is showing his capitalist mindset. So now we're going to look at how the inspector gives her her voice back when it's being taken away from her, when we're only seeing her life through the Burlings, through people of a much higher class than her. So the first one, and this really goes again against that quotation from Mr. Burling, she only had herself to blame, is a chain of events from the inspector. What I find interesting here, and I love this metaphor, I think it's one that you could build entire essays around. It really is the metaphor at the core of the play. If you look at a chain, so if you think about a chain, if you were to link your two fingers together right now like little loops in a chain, at any point in a chain, if a link is broken, then at that point the entire chain fails to be effective. If I had chains on a monster in front of you right now, and one of those links in that chain was broken, you would know that you are at risk from that monster. But if every chain was secure, the monster was clearly chained up, it was away from you, it was fine. However, as soon as you break one of those links, as soon as one of those links is weakened, you are then in danger again. So that's the point. When he says chain of events, it really shows that actually every single one of them was to blame. Every single one of them was responsible for what happened. Because if at any point one of them had done something differently, done something to make a positive change in Eva's life, then perhaps it wouldn't have led to the end of the chain, which was when Eva passed away at her own hand. So this puts the responsibility on everyone in that room, no matter what they did. If at any point they broke the chain, it would have been fine. If Mr. Burling kept her on at her job, she would not have gone to Millwoods, and then everything else wouldn't have happened from there. If Sheila hadn't fired her from Millwoods, where she was really enjoying her job, or gotten her fired, she wouldn't have ended up at the Palace Bar, where she met Gerald, who broke her heart. If Gerald hadn't have taken her on as a mistress and made her fall in love with him madly to then break her heart, perhaps she wouldn't have gone back to the Palace Bar and met Eric. And when she met Eric, she would not have gotten pregnant with a child that she couldn't take care of. If Eric had chosen to be nice to her that day, rather than using her for his own ends, she would not have gotten pregnant. If Mrs. Burling had given her the help and assistance she needed, then she could have raised that child properly. She could have raised that child and not needed to take the action that she takes at the end of the play, the drastic action to stop her suffering and the suffering of her unborn child. If at any point any of them had made a conscious choice to help her, that would have been fine. Now, the inspector also encourages us to feel a lot of empathy for her. So he says, a nice little promising life there, I thought, and a nasty mess somebody has made of it. Now, if we look at the contrast here in the adjectives that he uses, nice, little, promising, he's really talking about the working class as though they are worth something. saying nice, little, promising as well. So that word promising, that adjective, to say something is promising, it means you see the potential in it, you see the value in it. No one else sees the value in Eva, but Inspector Gould does, and he sees the value in her life. But then he says, in that contrast, a nasty mess, somebody's made of it. When you look at that contrast, he's blaming the Burlings. He's blaming the Burlings and Gerald. He says, nasty mess. They caused that mess. He also encourages us to feel sympathy for her again. She'd swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant, burnt her insides out, of course. Look at the gruesome imagery there. Burnt her inside out. If you look at that phrase, it is quite gory and it is quite shocking. And the point of shocking everyone, the point of using that imagery, is to encourage them to actually feel some sympathy for this girl who passed in this horrific way. And remember, when he's talking about Eva Smith, he's not just talking about one person, he's talking about all of the lower classes. Eva Smith symbolises all of the lower classes and all of their struggles. And if you look at all of the emotive language that he uses, he says their hopes, their fears, their suffering, and their chance of happiness. He says chance, which is quite specific there. He doesn't say they are happy, he says they have a chance of happiness, and that really shows the chance at happiness that they get is from the upper and middle classes really valuing them. So they do have a chance at happiness, but lots of things need to change in society to get them there. Now, if you look at the emotive language, he's using that to encourage us that actually Eva Smith has passed away. That's what he says. Eva Smith has passed away, but there are millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths. So again, if you look at that sort of metaphor of millions of Eva Smiths, millions of John Smiths, it's a metaphor for all the working classes. In that when he leaves the Burlings and when he leaves Gerald, if they make a change, they could help the next person. So they need to learn from their mistake from this person. And then they need to improve themselves. And lastly, we have this hyperbole over here. So it's better to ask for the earth than to take it. When you look at that hyperbole, it's really interesting because he talks about taking the earth, and that really is showing Priestley's idea that capitalists take the earth. So for Priestley, it's very black and white. He thinks that capitalists are greedy, and he thinks that they take everything. So when you say it's better to ask for the earth than to take it, the asking there, that verb to ask, is quite passive, it's quite peaceful. And that's what he's talking about with the working classes. They are asking for fair wages. They are asking for assistance. And they are doing that politely. But then he contrasts that verb with the more forceful verb take. To take the earth. And that's what he thinks the capitalists do. That's what he thinks the upper classes and the upper middle classes do. They take the earth from the people who are just asking for their fair share of it. So it's quite an important quotation. It's quite an important hyperbole as well. So we've gone through everything from Eva Smith. I will be going through more of these sheets for the other characters as well. And if you found this very interesting, if you could like it and subscribe, that would be fantastic. Thank you.